Konnichiwa minasan, namaskar, and welcome to the class in our second lecture series on Introduction to Japanese Language and Culture. In our previous class, we learnt giving and receiving, that is verbs which are required to give something to someone and verbs which are required to receive something from someone. So, how to use them, when to use them, what are the situations you will be using them in. So, we will continue with all this today as well, but also learn something new with kuremas. So, let us see what we have in our lecture today. Listen to this passage that we have here and let us see how much you understand. After that, I will do all the explanation.
日曜日にうちでパーティーがありました。会社からミラさんとラオさんがパーティーに来てくれました。私は友達と両親にたくさんプレゼントをもらいました。ラオさんはみんなにコクテールを作ってあげました。ミラさんはみんなのために歌を歌いました。私たちはみんなで11時まで踊りました。妻はおいしいご飯を作ってくれました。
So, you just heard the kaiwa. I will explain the things that you have not understood in the kaiwa right now. So, 日曜日にうちでパーティーがありました。There was a party at my house. 会社からミラさんとラオさんがパーティーに来てくれました。They came to my house. 私は友達と両親にたくさんプレゼントをもらいました。I received a lot of presents from my friends and my parents. ラオさんはみんなにコクテールを作ってあげました。He made cocktails and gave to everyone. ミラさんはみんなのために for everyone. 歌ってくれました。She sang for everyone. 私たちはみんなで all of us 11時まで踊りました。We danced. Then 妻はおいしいご飯を作ってくれました。妻 is 奥さん which is wife はおいしいご飯を作って she made and gave it to us. So, this is the simple kaiwa. There is lot of grammar here. So, we are going to take up each part at a time. Now, there is katakana, lot of kanji also. Some kanjis I am sure you will be able to recognize, if not be able to write. So, do that, practice your hiragana. Now, so far we have learnt that particle ni is used with arimas, and to show what? It shows location and existence of an object at a certain place. So, now you just saw in the kaiwa that we used particle de with arimas. So, how are we using particle de over here? You can see very clearly it has to be ni arimas. Ni shows location and de shows action. So, object wa place ni arimas. Now, look at this and see hon wa soko ni arimas. This is what we did. Hon wa tsukue no ue ni arimas. It is on top of the table. Kuruma wa chushajo ni arimasu. So, you will see that all three over here show location of a certain object. So, why are we using de? What is the reason for using de? The reason is that if aru comes with an event, that is if an event is happening at a certain place, then particle de is used with arimas. For example, you can see here in this picture, they are having a party over here. So, ashita tomodachi no uchi de party ga arimasu, or kino tomodachi no uchi de party ga arimashita, and kino. So, at a place event is there. So, it is not showing existence of an object, it is showing that an event is taking place at a certain location. You can look at these examples also over here. Ototoi gakkou de Tanaka sensei no kogi ga arimashita. So, there was an event which was a lecture and that took place at the gakkou. Now, over here there is sports day. So, you can see Raishu gakkou de, again at school undokai ga arimasu. So, this event is going to take place at school. And when is the time? The time is Raishu. So, I am sure by now it is very clear why de is being used over here. So, you can see place ni aru or iru, place ni object, aru and hito iru, iru and aru. Now, gakkou de undokai ga arimasu. It is taking place or happening. So, now we have learned different ways we can use particle de in our previous lessons. I want to tell you one more way you can use particle de. We already know that particle de shows how something is used to perform an action, that is, you use something, for example, hashi, a chopstick, to eat. So, hashi de gohan o tabemasu, or you will use a pen to write or a pencil to write, or a brush to paint. So, pen de kakimasu. Similarly, we can also use particle de for instruments or means used to do something. Now, this sounds a little confusing, so let us look at the example. Senshu sono eiga o terebi de mimashita. So, you can have a short kaiwa. Ano eiga o mimashita ka? Ano eiga desu ka? Senshu sono eiga o terebi de mimashita. So, you are talking about a eiga which both of you, the listener and the speaker, both know of. So, senshu ano eiga o terebi de mimashita. I saw it on TV. Then also another one very clear. Mainichi computer de 10 jikan shigoto o shimasu. Computer de. So, basically the meaning is on in English. I work on the computer, watashi wa computer de shigoto o shimasu. You could also say watashi wa YouTube de mimashita. So, now the verbs ageru, murau and kureru also have their honorific counterparts. I had talked about it earlier in our previous lesson. How are you going to use these verbs? What are the situations? With whom? For example, as they show respect, then you have to use them in formal situations, with people who are older to you in age and in rank. In business interactions, you have to use these verbs. So, have to be very, very careful when and how to use them. You can see from this picture over here, and we have also done this, person 1 wa, person 2 ni agemasu. And what are the people? You can give your friend, you can give your ototo, you can give your brothers and sisters, you can give someone else's sister, you can also give to your father, you can give to anybody. That person can give to someone else as well. Now, when you have to give to someone senior to you, how will you show respect? It is sashiageru. So, watashi wa sensei ni hon o sashiagemasu. And you will see who is giving? I am giving over here. So, I am the subject. Now, again you have done morau. Over here also you will see who is the subject? I am the subject. Watashi wa person 2 ni moraimashita. I received from, it could be Mira-san, it could be Chichi, it could be teacher. This you have done. Now, if you are receiving it from your teacher or from someone who is older to you, then for respect you will say itadakimasu. Again, watashi wa. I have received from someone. So, your position is over here and the person you were receiving it from is over here to show respect. Now, so far it has been I, the subject has been watashi. Now, if the subject changes and subject becomes person 2, that is the person who was giving you so far or the person you were giving to so far is going to give you, then what are you going to say? Person 2 wa person 1, that is me, I, ni kuremashita. So, sensei wa watashi ni hon o kuremashita. This is person 2 and this is person 1 who was the subject so far in ageru and morau. Now, the subject has changed. Now, if you want to be very polite and you have received something from someone, then sensei wa watashi ni hon o kudasaimashita or kudasatta. He gave. So, your position is here and sensei is over here. You are being very, very polite and honorific. Now, you can see from the examples over here, watashi wa tomodachi ni hana o agemashita. So, I am the subject over here. You can see very clearly with wa, agemashita. Tanaka-san wa sensei ni hon o sashiagemashita. So, I can give, Tanaka-san can give to anybody who is senior. Now, Mariko-san wa tomodachi ni or kara, meaning from, hana o moraimashita. It can be Mariko-san or it can be me also. Watashi wa tomodachi ni hana o moraimashita. Now, if it is from sensei that you are getting something, then watashi wa sensei ni or sensei kara hon o itadakimashita. I received from sensei. Or Mariko-san wa sensei ni hon o itadakimashita. So, sensei is over here and I am over here. I am being honorific and using itadakimasu. Moraimasu we have done earlier. You can give to people your age. So, itadakimasu, sashiagemasu will always be used in business situations or people senior in age and in rank. Then, Oto-san wa watashi ni hon o kuremashita. So, Oto-san is here and I am here and he is giving something to me. I am receiving something from him. You can see from the picture as well that Oto-san is giving me. So, I am here and Oto-san is here. Now, you can look at this that agemasu, give is to ageru in Japanese. To give something to someone is ageru. So, I give to Mira and Mira gives to me, but in Japanese it becomes kureru. Now, from this picture you can see over here I give you. I can give others also, someone else is also over here. So, I can give this person also. You can also give to others, which is Mira over here. So, in this case Mira can also give to others. Someone, anyone XYZ over here can give to someone else. So, all of it is written over here, you can see. So far I was giving, watashi wa ageru to anyone, ABC, anyone. Now, this person over here is giving me. Now, that becomes kureru. Someone gives to me, it could be anyone. This person over here, someone is giving to me, Mira-san is giving to me, or someone over here, this gentleman over here can also give to Mira. Now, another very important thing is the giver will be followed by particle va or ga, and the receiver will always be followed by particle ni. So, I give and I receive, but someone else gives me, that is Kureru. You can see from these examples, Chichi wa imoto ni tokei o agemashita. So, Chichi can give imoto, or I can give watashi wa imoto ni tokei o agemashita. So, all of this from this example you can see and understand very clearly. Now, Chichi wa watashi ni tokei o kuremashita, or Chichi wa imoto ni tokei o kuremashita. So, Chichi can give to imoto, Chichi can give to me as well over here. You can also understand it like this. For example, watashi, you and others. It could be anybody. So, I can give you, I can give others. You can also give others. Now, others can give you, others can give me, and you can also give me. So, this is ageru and this is kureru. Now, I have made these arrows over here. Try to make sentences on your own and see whether you can use ageru and kureru correctly. Now, another important thing that you have to keep in mind is when you are giving things to animals basically. So, you give them food, which is esa in Japanese, and the verb is yaru, yarimasu. Watashi wa inu ni esa o yaru or yarimasu, yarimasu. I give food to my dog, or if you have an aquarium at home, to your fish or to your birds. Now, you can quickly go over these sentences. I have already explained all of it in detail. Now, you will remember that we did te form of the verb as verb te kudasai and verb in te form plus imasu. Now, this very te form we can use it with kureru also and see what it means. The word kudasai means request, that is please do, and is coming from the verb kudasaru. So, when we say tabete kudasai, it means please eat, as the verb used there is taberu, which means to eat, or we can say chotto matte kudasai, which means to wait, and the verb used there is matsu, which means to wait. So, basically when you use verb in te kudasai form, kudasai is please and meaning comes from the verb that you are using. For example, taberu and matsu. So, matte kudasai and tabete kudasai. Tabete kudasai, please eat, and matte kudasai, please wait. Now, verb in te imasu form is continuous tense, where an action is happening over a period of time, and the time duration of the activity happening is not very long. The span is not very long, it is a short span. So, now if we use kureru instead of imasu, well, te kuremasu will mean someone did something or does something for me. For example, gohan o tsukutte kuremashita. Gohan o tsukutte kureta. So, basically it means made and gave gohan to me. So, someone does something for me, a favor done to me. In te kuremasu form, the subject is the benefactor, as you can see from the example. Now, see, Tanaka-san wa hana o kaimashita. He bought flowers. Tanaka-san wa watashi ni hana o kuremashita. He gave flowers to me. Gave over here. He gave flowers to me. So, if we join the two, basically meaning that he bought flowers and gave to me, how are we going to write it? Tanaka-san wa watashi ni, to me, hana o katte kuremashita. Verb in te form plus kureru. Bought and gave to me. So, you can practice now over here. Tanaka-san wa watashi ni hana o katte kuremashita, as we did in our last slide, and the verb over here is kau, which means to buy. Instead of hana, you can use dictionary or any other noun that you want to use. Tanaka-san wa watashi ni dress o katte kuremashita, or Tanaka-san wa watashi ni kuruma o katte kuremashita. Anything can come over here, any noun. Now, what are they doing over here? There is kanji written and these two are studying or doing something together, maybe joint studies together. So, Taro-kun wa watashi ni kanji o oshiete kuremashita. So, basically he told me and I received the favor. Verb is osheru, which means to teach or tell. For example, sensei wa oshiete kuremashita. Sensei told us. So, she told, and who received the favor? The students received the favor. Now, Taro-kun ga shukudai o tetsudatte kuremashita. So, verb is tetsudau, to help. To help. Taro-kun helped me to do the shukudai. So, he helped and I received the favor of him helping me finish my shukudai. Now, if we go back to our kaiwa, you will see how kuremasu is used in sentences. See, there is this picture of them celebrating, maybe a birthday party. So, kaisha kara tomodachi ga party ni kite kuremashita. So, they came to the party. So, tomodachi came and I was very happy. I received the favor of them coming home for my party. So, the verb is kuru in plain form, which is to come. And why are they saying kite kuremashita? Why this kuru and not iku? Because the party has already happened and they all came and everybody was at home. Thus, kimasu. There was another sentence there. Mira-san wa utatte kuremashita. So, Mira-san sang. It is to sing, and she sang and we all enjoyed. We enjoyed her singing. She sang for us. So, Mira-san wa utatte kuremashita. This is how you will use verb in te form plus kureru, to receive. Whatever is being said over here, whatever verb is being used over here, this is done and then received by you. Now, you also have bucho wa watashi ni hon o kudasaimashita. Now, we have done ageru, sashi ageru, morau, itadaku. Then we have done kureru. So, the honorific is kudasaru, from where kudasai is also coming. So, then because it is bucho, it could be sensei, it could be some business associate, maybe Tanaka-san. So, wa watashi ni hon o kudasai mashita. He gave me a book. So, being very, very polite over here with kudasai mashita. And again, you can replace hon with anything, any noun over here. Now, this is a small kaiwa by one of my students using te murau and te kureru form. I want you to go over the kaiwa, see how much you can understand, and whatever is left, I am going to tell you in your next class. Even the explanation of this kaiwa I am not writing over here. You can see the kaiwa written in the script, look at the kanjis, the katakana and the hiragana, practice all of it, and explanation will be done only next time.
ねえ兄さん、明日国際婦人デーですね。お母さんに何をあげましょうか？
そうですね。
ねえ、服はどうですか？
いいけど、お母さんに毎年服をあげるから、今回特別なものをあげたいです。
そうですね。
お母さんの腰が痛いので、マッサージチェアはどうですか？
お兄さんすごいよ。いつ買いに行きますか？
インターネットで買って送ってもらった方がいいよ。
じゃあその時私に漫画を買ってくれますか？
いいよ、買ってあげますよ。
ありがとう。
So, with this I would like to end today's class. We have done quite a few things. We have done ageru, we have done morau, we have done itadaku, sashi ageru, kureru, kudasaru, all of it, how to use it in te form. There is still more left in this giving and receiving, which we will continue next week. Till then, I would like you to practice all of it at home. Do passages, do short conversations, make short dialogues and practice at home with your partner. If not with somebody, then alone, and come prepared for your next class. Till then, mata aimashou. Arigatou gozaimashita.